Hey everybody, Kevin here. I guess I'll start by giving a little bit of my own reader response, as that is my topic here, to this book. There's a reason I chose it, and there are several reasons I love this book, and reasons that kind of connect to why I chose the theories that I chose. First, this book's about subjectivism. Um, it's about individual perspectives on the subject of falling in love for the first time. It gets young love. It is deeply felt. Sad in all the right ways, funny in all the right ways, awkward in all the right ways. It opened my eyes to the female perspective of attraction in ways some of my favorite movies do, especially movies from the male angle. I'm thinking of movies like 500 Days of Summer or a movie I love called Chasing Amy. It's built on convergence of character and culture, which is sort of where the media studies and reader response theories combine. It's loaded with 80s nostalgia, which I love, and which connects to now, right now, in many ways, if you think like Stranger Things, for example, which I love. Simply, I adore the pop culture and I adore the relationship in this that is central to this book. So that's what I'm calling this Two Hearts Converge. Reader Response Theory and Media Studies. A look at Eleanor and Park by Rainbow Rowell. Right now, I'm going to ask you guys to just play along for a minute. Just look and listen.
I'm the sun and the air. All the shine is that it's through my heart and golden. I'm the sun and air, but nothing in particular. You shut your mouth, how can you say? I go about things the wrong way. I am human and I need to be loved, just like everybody else does.
So that was a song by the Smiths from 1985 called "How Soon Is Now," and it's a song that's actually mentioned several times in the early parts of this book. And it's one that I instantly connect to. It's a song that I know and love. So in some ways, it kind of acted as a window into the book for me. If you were to read the first page of this book, there are three, four, five, at least somewhere around a half a dozen pop culture references that any given number of students might have to look up or either know or connect to. And that's an interesting thing about this book and would be an interesting thing to have conversations about. In Bresler's chapter on reader oriented theories in his book on literary criticism, he opens with an analogy about a birthday party. It's been built up with all these neighborhood kids, and all the neighborhood kids show up and they can't get into the house, so they start to look in different windows. And each kid looks in a window and sees this different amazing thing. And this is basically an analogy to represent the idea of reader response criticism and theory, which basically says that the house represents a literary text, to quote Henry James, with each window being an individual reader's distinct view into our impression of that literary work. So, what is my way in? I think of a passage on page 98, a passage that makes me think of my mother and my childhood. That Eleanor remembers her mother lighting incense and putting on her favorite records, Judy Collins and Crosby, Stills and Nash. This might as well be a moment from my own memory. So this is an access point for me to personally connect to the story. And this is what reader response is first and foremost all about. So I'll ask you to stop and uh, kind of respond to what you've seen so far. So what's your way in? Take a couple minutes to think about what you've seen so far and connect to your own connections to Eleanor and Park in your day book or journal. So go ahead and pause for just a second and respond to that and then come back. So reader response theory is all about concern for the reader. So here's some basics. Reader response criticism, or reader-oriented theory, believes in a few things. One, it believes that reading is a transactional experience. This is represented by Louise M. Rosenblatt in the Bresler text, and connects to this sort of math problem, right? So the idea being that the reader plus the text equals meaning, that a text can't read itself by itself. So a text requires you to be part of it and to make meaning. It also believes that in order to determine a text's meaning, students and readers, and students is key, we'll get to that a little bit later, have to become active readers and participants in the interpretive process. So they have to include themselves. That it is exemplified by various assumptions and methodologies used to discover meaning. So this is where a lot of classroom strategies come in, making connections, making predictions, writing responses in journals, thinking about ways you connect to the text and access the text in order to start conversations and come to some sort of either collective meaning or individual meaning. And this starts, like many literary theories, with all the way back with Plato, so who believed that a play could inflame the passions of the audience. So he believed that the audience was an active part of the experience of a story. So let's talk a little bit of business. Here are some reader-oriented theorists and terminology. So I.A. Richards said that that life experiences provide a kind of reality check, either validating or negating the authenticity of the experiences as represented in a text. This harkens back in some ways to the idea of structuralism and Saussure, and specific codes that draw us in via language into a text. So I think about the coding that I used as I read this book, knowing what I was going to do with it. That I made kind of a system where I was circling pop culture references that I connected to, and I was drawing a square around things that I thought might be challenging for students given the time period differences, and really just there's a system that allows for the reader to work with the structure of a text within this theory. There's also the idea of narratology, and this is from the theorist Gerald Prince, who talks about the specific ways to analyze a text based on the telling of the story, like the narrator and the voice and the style, etc. And also plays into the idea of point of view. This book is very much about point of view. It's got two very specific subjective points of view. Sometimes they interconnect, sometimes they are very separate, and it sort of gets you into the head of both sides of a young love experience. And then there's also the idea of the narratee. So the three different types of readers, and there'll be more information on this in my handout, but I'll be brief. So the real reader being you, the person who's reading the book. The virtual reader being the person the author kind of envisions reading the book. And then the ideal reader, which is the person who really gets it, who gets all the nuances and the meanings and the connections and is able to kind of fully grasp the book. There's also Wolfgang Iser, who had a lot to say about horizon of expectations and gaps, and these are the kinds of things that are in basic form. This is just the kind of expectations, the predictions that we readers make as we read. We stop and we think, okay, well, what's going to happen next? It's the things that move the plot forward and keep us wanting to continue to read. And so these gaps are created for us to fill in with our horizon of expectations and then come back around to how those gaps and horizons change over the course of the book. And then there's the idea of the classroom, the interpretive community, which Stanley Fish talks about. And this is all about bringing the experiences that truly connect readers together to make meaning. So in a classroom, you're going to have however many students you have, you're going to have probably that many different perspectives and access points and windows, and you're going to have to use discussions and strategies and questioning and journaling and reflecting in order to get down to what the class maybe collectively understands about the text. So in short, this is related to strategies we use to connect students to a piece of literature in a classroom. So let's talk about cultural convergence. There's an interesting thing I was brought into through my work in the literary theory course, where reader response theory has kind of recently blended with media studies. And this is something that I'm highly interested in, and it actually kind of also connects to the idea of new historicism, that a text is influenced subjectively by the history of the time and the zeitgeist and the popular culture of the time. So I read the introduction to a book called Convergence Culture, Where Old and New Media Collide, by Henry Jenkins. And he says in the introduction, circulation of media content across different media systems, competing media economies, and national borders depends heavily on consumers' active participation. So I thought there's an interesting connection there, and I hope you'll take a second and pause the video and respond to this prompt that's in bold here in your day book for a couple minutes. What do you notice about this quote from Jenkins? So, and connect your notices to Eleanor and Park. So go ahead and pause and then come back. So here's where we get into Eleanor and Park proper. Here are a couple of examples of what I mean by this idea of media convergence with character, the sort of things that I mentioned at the top. So here's a passage that I connected to early on. He was holding a comic called Watchmen, and it looked so ugly that Eleanor decided not to bother eavesdropping, or eaves reading, whatever. She liked it best when he read the X-Men. Rowell, page 39. If you think about unpacking this, there's a lot of connections that can be made. There's convergence. So you have the idea of Watchmen, a comic book that's very different from the X-Men, and it's kind of, if you know the two, especially, you know that the Watchmen is kind of a darker, grittier, sort of politically inclined statement from the 1980s, and X-Men is more fun comic book kind of escape. And Eleanor, we come to know her in some way because of that. If you connect between time periods, you know that Watchmen has been made into a movie. There have been series of X-Men movies dating all the way back from the year 2000 on that have continued to come out. And then you have an HBO series, and HBO is actually mentioned in this book, of the Watchmen that's coming out very soon, like in the next couple of months. And so what you get here is you get this convergence where you start to understand both characters, and you start to see the kinds of things that they like and the ways they're different, but also the ways they're similar. And you start to understand where they are at this time and where they might be headed as the book continues. You also have connections like this. So this is a sort of the way the book does, where it splits the two characters back and forth. There's in two consecutive pages, Eleanor, in her narration, he was touching her all the places she was afraid to be touched, on page 248. And then the very next page, Park. She was so gentle compared to him. Maybe she didn't want him like he wanted her, but even if she wanted him half as much. And you notice the use of the ellipsis, the three dots. So what we have here is the idea of that this book takes on of subjective experience. So the inner monologue of each character, and the way they use punctuation, and the way that punctuation connect, or the way Rowell uses punctuation, the way that punctuation connects the ideas, the ways they're thinking at the moment. It provides this very specific look at the separate point of view. They're connected between each other's narratives throughout. Let's take a moment though and look about at how this book connects them within each other's narratives.
I love you.
I know.
So I can't be sure that everybody's seen The Empire Strikes Back, but if you haven't, there's a very key part in this very same scene that I was talking about in the last slide, in which they have a dialogue within Park's narrative. So the conversation is something like this: they're kind of making out. It's a love scene. I'm totally the Han Solo, she whispered. It was good to hear. It was good to remember it was Eleanor under all this new flesh. Well, I'm not the Princess Leia, he said. Don't get so hung up on gender roles, Eleanor said. And this is page 250. And so I had hoped, I made a note when I started to map this out, that I hope that Denise, who's doing the gender studies look at this book, points into this scene as well, because it's got some really specific things to say about gender, and that I think we could all have some subjective connection to. Um, Here's another quote from Jenkins, and it kind of seals up the point of what I'm getting at before we move on to the next thing and a little activity. That convergence occurs within the brains of individual consumers and through their social interactions with others. So the idea of connecting Star Wars and comic books and the pop culture of the time and the conversations of intimate scenarios that are both within the brains of the characters and also outside of them, and how they connect and talk to each other, all come together to create this idea of convergence. So here's a kind of fun activity. I love top five lists, and I'm hoping that you guys might take a minute to stop here in just a second. I'll read over the instructions. But take a few minutes and really think about your reading of this book, and think about some of these ideas of convergence of media and human interaction. So in your daybook or journal, take a few minutes and respond to the idea of moments of convergence where media collides with human interaction by helping me finish this top five list. So I've started it for you. We have the reading over the shoulder scene with Watchmen and X-Men. We have the love scene that connects with the separate inner monologues, and then also the dialogue about Empire Strikes Back. And so I've left 3, 2, and 1 blank, and I'm hoping that you'll fill that in your daybook. Take about 5 minutes or so, and really think about some of these moments of convergence that stood out to you as you read this book. So go ahead and pause the video and then come back. Now, to circle back to the sort of traditional reader response criticism, it's worth talking about the idea of the horizon of expectations and gaps. This is the thing that happens in English classes all the time through discussions. And as you're reading a novel with a class, for example, you might stop for a minute and talk about, okay, so what are your predictions? What do you think is going to happen next? Or what are you feeling right now? And what kind of gaps you noticing? Like, what is the story? What is the author purposefully leaving out? So Wolfgang Iser, his way of looking at horizon of expectations is that a reader's expectations about what will or may or should happen next. So if we think about the idea of an author leaving a gap or creating a horizon of expectations, you look at a line like this, or a scene like this. But now it was like their mom wanted them all out of the way before he came home. And this is speaking of the character Richie, who is the just horrible mom's boyfriend / stepfather character that essentially is ruining everyone's life as far as Eleanor's family is concerned. So this plays into the idea of dramatic irony. There's this feeling of tension that is created, and that all has to do with dramatic irony, which is a very reader responsey type of thing. So the reader plus text phenomenon is very built on dramatic irony. And then there's the idea of Richie as this character, this essence of conflict and suspense throughout the book. We're always sort of waiting for the other shoe to drop. When is he going to finally snap? When is he going to blow up? And when he does snap, how does that create a new horizon of expectations? For example, there's like this closing of a gap, fulfilling a horizon, and then there's the opening of a new horizon of expectations. So, for example, Richie was in the living room. He hadn't got out of bed until 2 or 3, and everybody could tell he was in a bad mood. Fuck, Sabrina, can't you shut her up? So we have this very angry, hard man finally losing his temper, and this, page 152 goes on and on with him calling her these horrible, horrific names, and fat, and cursing, and he's drunk, hungover, whatever he is, and it's just an absolute awful experience. And you get really in tune with finally at this moment in the book seeing what we've expected all the time, that he's going to snap at some point and kind of actively destroy Eleanor's life, and that's a major thread in the book. So let's respond to this. So think about this particular strand with Richie. There are plenty of other places where this happens. So how does this particular horizon of expectations, or this particular strand, continue to evolve as the novel reaches its culmination? So there's kind of more that happens after this, and there's some issues in between as well that kind of act on this initial gap. So I would love to give you a moment to kind of think about that and reflect about that, and then we'll move on. So trying to express how, as a plot element, how Richie as a plot element affected your experience of reading this novel. So go ahead and pause there and take a few minutes and respond. Okay, so it's worth noting a little bit about an interpretive community. So together and separately, we just, as an interpretive community, did the following. We just reacted to the 1980s setting and its way of connecting us with the characters through popular culture or media. We provided our own subjective window into the novel. We discussed specific terminology and theorists related to reader response or reader-oriented criticism. We made connections in the form of a popular list site to the way media and character converge throughout the novel. And we practiced interpreting a strand of the novel through a look at one of its constant gaps. So one more thing. As you enter a discussion with your classmates through our discussion posts and your reaction to this book through this workshop, consider the following things. So for the interpretive community aspect, what are some other horizons of expectations or gaps that you noticed in Eleanor and Park? And for you personally, how does Eleanor and Park work for you? Are you Eleanor or are you Park, or perhaps a blend? Does this novel resonate with you at all? That is, are you the ideal reader for this novel? If not, why not? And if it does connect with you, then what are the moments that resonate with you the most in this novel? And I would especially like to see people responding to the media connections. Thank you.
I wanna know what love is. I want you to show me. I wanna feel what love is. I know you can show me. I'm gonna take a little time to look around me. I've got nowhere left to hide. It looks like love has finally found me. In my life, there's been heartache and pain. I don't know if I can face it again. I can't stop now. I've traveled so far to change this lonely life. I wanna know what love is. I want you to show me. I wanna feel